Good evening, families. Tonight I'm going to be reading chapters 4 through 9 of Flora and Ulysses, our One School, One Book. Chapter 4, A Surprisingly Helpful Cynic. Flora ran from her room. She ran down the stairs. As she ran, she thought, for a cynic, I am a surprisingly helpful person. She went out the back door. Her mother called to her. She said, "Where are you going, Flora Belle?" Flora didn't answer her. She never answered her mother when she called her Flora Belle. Sometimes she didn't answer her mother when she called her Flora either. Flora ran through the tall grass and cleared the fence between her yard and the Tickmans in a single bound. "Move out of the way," said Flora. She gave Mrs. Tickham a shove and grabbed hold of the vacuum cleaner. It was heavy. She picked it up and shook it. Nothing happened. She shook harder. The squirrel dropped out of the vacuum cleaner and landed with a plop on the grass. He didn't look that great. He was missing a lot of fur vacuumed off, Flora assumed. Her eyelids fluttered. His chest rose and fell and rose again, and then it stopped moving altogether. Flora knelt. She put a finger on the squirrel's chest. Here's the illustration for that page. At the back of each issue of the Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto, there was a series of bonus comics. One of Flora's very favorite bonus comics was entitled, Terrible Things Can Happen to You. As a cynic, Flora found it wise to be prepared. Who knew what horrible, unpredictable thing would happen next? Terrible Things Can Happen to You detailed what action to take if you inadvertently consumed plastic fruit. This happened more often than you would suppose. Some plastic fruit was extremely realistic looking. How to perform the Heimlich maneuver on your elderly Aunt Edith if she choked on a stringy piece of steak at an all-you-can-eat buffet. What to do if you were wearing a striped shirt and a swarm of locusts descended. Run. Locusts eat stripes. And of course, how to administer everyone's favorite life-saving technique, CPR. Terrible Things Can Happen to You did not, however, detail exactly how someone was supposed to give CPR to a squirrel. "I'll figure it out," said Flora. "What will you figure out?" said Mrs. Tickham. Flora didn't answer her. Instead, she bent down and put her mouth on the squirrel's mouth. It tasted funny. If she were forced to describe it, she would say it tasted exactly like squirrel. Fuzzy, damp, slightly nutty. "Have you lost your mind?" said Mrs. Tickham. Flora ignored her. She breathed into the squirrel's mouth. She pushed down on his small chest. She started to count. Chapter 5, The Squirrel Obliges. Something strange had happened to the squirrel's brain. Things had gone black, and then into this blackness there came a light so beautiful, so bright, that the squirrel had to run away. A voice spoke to him. "What's that?" said the squirrel. The light shone brighter. The voice spoke again. "Okay," said the squirrel. "You bet." He wasn't sure what exactly he was agreeing to, but it didn't matter. He was just so happy. He was floating in a great lake of light, and the voice was singing to him. Oh, it was wonderful. It was the best thing ever. And then there was a loud noise. The squirrel heard another voice. This voice was counting. The light receded. "Breathe!" the new voice shouted. The squirrel obliged. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and then another, and another. The squirrel returned. Chapter 6, In the Event of a Seizure. "Well, he's breathing," said Mrs. Tickham. "Yes," said Flora, "he is." She felt a swell of pride. The squirrel rolled over onto his stomach. He raised his head. His eyes were glazed. "For heaven's sakes," said Mrs. Tickham, "look at him." She chuckled quietly. She shook her head, and then she laughed out loud. She kept laughing. She laughed and laughed and laughed. She laughed so hard that she started to shake. Was she having some kind of fit? Flora tried to remember what terrible things can happen to you, advised in the event of a seizure. It had something to do with moving the tongue out of the way or stabilizing it with a stick, or something. Flora had saved the squirrel's life, and she didn't see any reason she couldn't save Mrs. Tickham's tongue. The sun sank a little lower in the sky. Mrs. Tickham continued to laugh hysterically. And Flora Bell Buckman started looking around the Tickhams' backyard for a stick. Chapter 7. The Soul of a Squirrel. The squirrel was a little unsteady on his feet. His brain felt larger, roomier. It was as if several doors in the dark room of himself, doors he hadn't even known existed, had suddenly been flung wide. Everything was shot through with meaning, purpose, light. However, the squirrel was still a squirrel, and he was hungry. Very. I'm going to show you the illustrations for this page. And then over here, it says, who can say what astonishments are hidden inside this mundane being? Mundane being. It's hard to see them. You can follow along in your book. Chapter 8, Helpful Information. Flora and Mrs. Tickham noticed at the same time. The squirrel, said Flora. The vacuum cleaner, said Mrs. Tickham. Together they stared at the Ulysses 2000X and at the squirrel who was holding it over his head with one paw. That can't be, said Mrs. Tickham. The squirrel shook the vacuum cleaner. That can't be, said Mrs. Tickham. You already said that, said Flora. I'm repeating myself? You're repeating yourself. Maybe I have a brain tumor, said Mrs. Tickham. It was certainly possible that Mrs. Tickham had a brain tumor. Flora knew from reading Terrible Things Can Happen to You that a surprising number of people were walking around with tumors in their brains and didn't even know it. That was the thing about tragedy. It was just sitting there, keeping you company, waiting, and you had absolutely no idea. This was the kind of helpful information you could get from comics, if you paid attention. The other kind of information that you absorbed from the regular reading of comics, most particularly from the regular reading of The Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto, was that impossible things could happen all the time. For instance, heroes, superheroes, were born of ridiculous and unlikely circumstances. Spider bites, chemical spills, planetary dislocation, and, in the case of Alfred T. Slipper, from the accidental submersion in an industrial-sized vat of cleaning solution called Incandesto, the cleaning professional's hard-working friend. I don't think you have a brain tumor, said Flora. There might be another explanation. Uh-huh, said Mrs. Tickman. What's the other explanation? Have you ever heard of Incandesto? What? Said Mrs. Tickham. Who? Said Flora. Incandesto is a who. He's a superhero. Right, said Mrs. Tickham. And your point is? Flora raised her hand. She pointed with a single finger at the squirrel. Surely you're not implying, said Mrs. Tickham. The squirrel lowered the vacuum cleaner to the ground. He held himself very still. He considered both of them. His whiskers twitched and trembled. There were cracker crumbs on his head. He was a squirrel. Could he be a superhero too? Alfred T. Slipper was a janitor. Most of the time, people looked right past him. Sometimes, often in fact, they treated him with disdain. They had no idea of the astonishing acts of heroism, the blinding light contained with his outward, humdrum disguise. Only Alfred's parakeet, Dolores, knew who he was and what he could do. The world will misunderstand him, said Flora. You bet it will, said Mrs. Tickham. Tootie, shouted Mr. Tickham from the back door. Tootie, I'm hungry. Tootie? What a ridiculous name. Flora couldn't resist the urge to say it out loud. Tootie, she said. Tootie Tickham? Listen, Tootie, go inside. Feed your husband. Say nothing to him or to anyone else about any of this." "Right," said Tootie. "Say nothing. Feed my husband." "Okay, right." She began walking slowly toward the house. Mr. Chickham called out, "Are you done vacuuming? What about the Ulysses? Are you just going to leave it sitting there?" "Ulysses," whispered Flora. She felt a shiver run from the back of her head to the base of her spine. She might be a natural-born cynic, but she knew the right word when she heard it. "Ulysses," she said again. She bent down and held out her hand to the squirrel. "Come here, Ulysses," she said. Chapter 9. The Whole World on Fire. She spoke to him, and he understood her. What the girl said was, "Ulysses, come here, Ulysses," and without thinking, he moved toward her. "It's okay," she said, and he believed her. "It's astonishing." Everything was astonishing. The setting sun was illuminating each blade of grass. It was reflecting off the girl's glasses, making a halo of light around the girl's round head, setting the whole world on fire. The squirrel thought, "When did things become so beautiful? And if it has been this way all along, how is it that I never noticed before?" "Listen to me," the girl said. "My name is Flora. Your name is Ulysses." "Okay," thought the squirrel. She put her hand on him. She picked him up. She cradled him in her left arm. He felt nothing but happiness. Why had he always been so terrified of humans? He couldn't imagine. Actually, he could imagine. Here's Flora with the squirrel Ulysses. There had been that time with the boy and the BB gun. There had truthfully been a lot of incidents with humans, some involving BB guns, some not, and all of them had been violent, terrifying, and soul-destroying. But this was a new life, and he was a changed squirrel. He felt spectacular, strong, smart, capable, and also hungry. He was very, very hungry. That's the end of our time together tonight. Make sure to listen in tomorrow for more of our story, Flora and Ulysses, from another member of Deckerville Schools.